El Alamein, Egypt. Night, the 23rd of October, 1942. The desert is colder than men expect. After sunset, the heat drains from the sand, leaving a brittle silence across the Alamein line. The Mediterranean lies somewhere to the north, unseen. To the south, the Qattara Depression stretches into darkness, an impassable void. Between them, a narrow corridor of sand and wire. This is where the war in North Africa has narrowed to a single front. At 9:40 p.m., the stillness breaks. More than 800 British guns open fire in unison. The night erupts in flame. Shells tear across the horizon in a continuous roar, hammering German and Italian positions held by the Panzer Army, Africa. The sky flickers orange and white. The ground trembles without pause. Behind the barrage, infantry begin to move, and farther back still, almost forgotten in the chaos, sit 19 anti-tank guns, dug low into the sand. Their crews wait in silence. No cheering, no shouting, just hands on breech blocks, eyes fixed on the dark. Hours later, the artillery will stop, and from the black horizon, engines will begin to growl. By October 1942, the Desert War had already burned for more than 2 years. It began in June 1940, when Italy declared war on Britain and pushed eastward from Libya into Egypt. The advance was cautious. British forces counterattacked. Within months, the Italians were reeling back across Cyrenaica. Then, in February 1941, Germany intervened. The man sent to salvage the collapsing front was Erwin Rommel. Rommel arrived with the newly formed Afrika Korps. What followed was a campaign of maneuver unlike any other theater of the war. Units advanced hundreds of miles across open desert. Supply lines stretched thin. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Tobruk became a name known across Europe. British and Commonwealth troops learned to fear the speed of German armored thrusts. Rommel's reputation grew with every rapid strike. Yet beneath the legend lay a constant weakness: logistics. North Africa was a supply war. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every spare part had to cross the Mediterranean from Italy, survive British naval interdiction, land in Tripoli or Benghazi, and then travel over 1,000 miles of desert road. Fuel shortages were chronic, spare parts scarce, replacement tanks slow to arrive. By mid-1942, however, Rommel achieved his greatest success. In May and June, during the Battle of Gazala, Axis forces shattered British defenses. Tobruk fell on the 21st of June 1942, yielding 33,000 Allied prisoners. The victory stunned London. Winston Churchill later called it one of the heaviest blows of the war. Rommel pushed east into Egypt. His objective was clear: seize the Suez Canal. If Egypt fell, Britain's imperial lifeline to India and the Middle East would fracture. The Axis would threaten oil fields in Iraq and Persia. The strategic balance in the Mediterranean could collapse. But by July 1942, the advance stalled at a small railway halt called El Alamein. Geography decided the battlefield. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south stretched the Qattara Depression, a vast salt marsh too soft for tanks to cross. Between them was a corridor barely 40 miles wide. No wide flanking maneuvers were possible here. No sweeping desert bypass. Any army attacking would have to break straight through. In July, the First Battle of Alamein stopped Rommel's advance. His forces, exhausted and undersupplied, dug in. Meanwhile, the British command changed. General Claude Auchinleck was replaced in August 1942 by Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery inherited the British Eighth Army at a moment of crisis. Morale had suffered from repeated retreats. Equipment losses were severe, yet reinforcements were arriving steadily from Britain and the United States. Montgomery did not rush. He refused immediate offensives. He rebuilt formations. He reorganized supply. He trained relentlessly. His plan was not maneuver warfare. It was attrition. He would use overwhelming firepower to grind the Axis army down. By October 1942, the balance of material had shifted dramatically. The British 8th Army fielded nearly 200,000 men. It possessed over 1,000 tanks, including new American M4 Shermans, and more than 800 artillery pieces. Air superiority was strengthening daily. Rommel's Panzer Army Afrika, by contrast, had roughly 100,000 men. Operational German tanks numbered fewer than 250. Many were worn. Fuel reserves were critically low. Reinforcements from Europe were intercepted repeatedly by Allied air and naval forces. On the 23rd of September 1942, Rommel left for Germany on sick leave. He suffered from exhaustion and liver problems. Command temporarily passed to General George Stumme. Montgomery chose his moment carefully. The offensive would begin on the night of the 23rd of October, 1942. It was codenamed Operation Lightfoot. And buried within that vast offensive, amid infantry divisions, armored brigades, and thousands of guns, a small anti-tank position would soon face the armored heart of the Afrika Korps. Operation Lightfoot was not designed as a single breakthrough. It was designed as pressure, constant, relentless, mechanical. Montgomery's plan called for infantry divisions to advance first under cover of darkness. Their task was to clear narrow lanes through vast Axis minefields, the Devil's Gardens, so that British armor could pass through at dawn. The name Lightfoot referred to the infantry themselves. Soldiers would not detonate anti-tank mines. Tanks would. Two main corridors would be opened in the northern sector of the line. There, near the Mediterranean coast, the terrain was firmer. The Axis expected the main blow to fall in the south. Montgomery intended otherwise. At 9:40 p.m. on the 23rd of October, 1942, the artillery barrage began. For nearly 5 hours, British guns fired over 1 million shells. It was one of the heaviest concentrations of artillery used by the British Army to that point in the war. The desert night flickered continuously. Infantry from the 9th Australian Division, 51st Highland Division, 2nd New Zealand Division, 2nd New Zealand Division, and others began their advance behind the creeping barrage. Engineers followed, probing for mines under fire. Progress was slower than planned. Minefields were deeper than intelligence suggested. Gaps became congested. By dawn on the 24th of October, the corridors were incomplete. German defensive lines had not collapsed. They bent. They absorbed. General Stumme, visiting forward units to assess the attack, reportedly died of a heart attack under fire that same morning. With his death, temporary command confusion spread. A message was sent to Germany. Rommel was urgently recalled. The British push did not achieve immediate breakthrough. Instead, the battle became what Montgomery intended, a grinding contest of endurance. The Axis response followed established doctrine. German anti-tank guns, particularly the 88 8mm, were deployed in depth. Armored units were held back for counterattack. Rather than commit tanks blindly into British artillery fire, the Germans waited for opportunities to strike exposed formations attempting to widen the corridors. And that opportunity appeared. In the northern sector, around a featureless stretch of desert, later known as Kidney Ridge, and the areas west of Tel El Isa. British armored units, pushing through the minefield gaps, began to consolidate their gains. The terrain offered little cover, shallow ridges, low scrub, hard sand. Behind the forward infantry, anti-tank regiments were moved up quickly to secure the penetrations. Their mission was clear. Once the armor passed through, hold the flanks against inevitable German counterattack. Among these units were batteries equipped primarily with the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, smaller than the German 88, but accurate, low-silhouetted, and deadly at medium range, dug into hull-down positions. These guns could disappear almost entirely into the desert. Rommel returned to North Africa on the 25th of October. He arrived to a deteriorating situation. The British had not broken through, but they were applying continuous pressure. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Every counterattack consumed precious reserves. Replacement tanks were scarce, yet doctrine demanded action. To allow the British to consolidate inside the minefields would be fatal. If the 8th Army established secure corridors and brought its full armored strength to bear, the Panzer Army would be forced into static defense, something it could not sustain for long. So German Panzer units were ordered forward. Elements of the 15th Panzer Division and 21st Panzer Division prepared to strike at the exposed British penetration in the north. Their objective: smash the corridor, destroy the forward armor, and restore the defensive line. They did not yet know that waiting just beyond the shallow ridge line were 19 carefully concealed guns. The engines began to move at first light, and the desert would soon fill with smoke. They were not elite commandos. They were gunners. Most belonged to British anti-tank regiments attached to infantry divisions pushing through the northern corridor near Kidney Ridge. Many had fought in earlier desert campaigns: Tobruk, Gazala, Mersa, Matruh. They had retreated before Rommel more than once. They understood what German armor could do in open ground. Their weapon was the Ordnance QF 6-pounder, low to the ground. Small silhouette, solid armor-piercing shot, effective within 1,000 yards. It lacked the dramatic reputation of the German 88 mm, but it had advantages in concealment and mobility. In the desert, survival often depended on who fired first. The crews dug deep. They scraped shallow pits so only the gun shield showed above the sand. Ammunition boxes were buried beside them to reduce exposure. Range markers were quietly placed in the dark hours before dawn. There would be no second chance once firing began. Unlike tank crews, anti-tank gunners could not withdraw quickly. Once revealed, they became priority targets. German doctrine dictated immediate suppression, high explosive shells, machine gun fire, coordinated flanking movements. The men understood this. They checked traversing gears, cleared sand from breach mechanisms, set sights for expected approach distances. Some had written letters days earlier. Others said nothing at all. Behind them lay infantry, consolidating their hard-won ground. Ahead of them, the desert floor shimmered in early morning light. They were not ordered to advance. They were ordered to hold, and that distinction would define the coming hours. His earlier victories in North Africa were built on rapid concentration of armored force. Strike hard at a weak point. Break cohesion. Roll through rear areas before the enemy reorganizes. But October 1942 was different. Fuel levels were critically low. Replacement tanks were limited. Allied air superiority increasingly harassed daytime movement. The once fluid desert battlefield had narrowed into a constricted corridor between sea and depression. Still, the principles remained. When reports reached Rommel that British forces had pushed through minefields in the north, he recognized the danger immediately. If the breach widened, the 8th Army could pour armor through and split the Axis line. he ordered elements of the 15th and 21st Panzer divisions to counterattack toward the penetration area. German Panzer strength at Alamein was already reduced, roughly 200 operational tanks at the battle's outset, including Panzer III and Panzer IV models, many mechanically strained. Each vehicle represented irreplaceable combat power. The counterattack was not reckless. It was calculated necessity. German armored formations would advance in coordinated waves supported by anti-tank guns and artillery. Their objective was not merely to repel infantry, but to destroy British armor before it could mass. They expected to meet tanks. What they did not expect was a disciplined anti-tank screen lying almost invisible in the sand. And as the Panzers crested the shallow rises west of the British corridor, they entered killing ground prepared with patience rather than speed. In the desert, technology was rarely abstract. It was immediate, measured in penetration and impact. The British Ordnance QF 6-pounder fired a 57 mm solid armor-piercing shot at high velocity. At 500 yards, it could penetrate the frontal armor of most German Panzer III variants and the side armor of early Panzer IV models. Its small size allowed it to be dug almost flush with the ground, a critical advantage in flat terrain. By contrast, the German Panzer III and IV relied on mobility and coordinated maneuver. The long-barreled Panzer IV Oz F2, introduced earlier in 1942, mounted a powerful 75 mm gun capable of destroying Allied tanks at extended ranges, but armor thickness remained moderate by later war standards. Side plates were vulnerable if caught in crossfire. The key was visibility. Tank optics gave crews a higher vantage point. Anti-tank guns relied on concealment and discipline. In open desert, the side that fired first often dictated the engagement's outcome. British doctrine at El Alamein emphasized layered defense. Anti-tank guns were positioned not as isolated weapons, but in mutually supporting arcs. One gun covered another. If German tanks attempted to outflank a position, they risked exposing their side armor to a neighboring emplacement. Artillery fire was registered in advance. The desert offered no forests, no villages, only shallow undulations in sand and limestone ridges. In such terrain, a well-sighted gun line became invisible until it spoke. When the German panzers advanced toward the British penetration, they saw dust, perhaps the silhouette of distant vehicles. What they did not see were low gun shields half buried behind scrub and sand. Technology did not guarantee victory. Position did. When the first German tanks appeared on the horizon, distance collapsed quickly. The morning sun was rising behind the British lines, casting long shadows forward. Heat shimmered distorted outlines. Range estimation became critical. Gunners waited. Training dictated restraint. Firing too early would reveal position and allow German crews to adjust. Firing too late risked being overrun. Orders were passed quietly down the line. Hold until effective range. Then came the first shot. The recoil slammed backward into the trails. The spent casing ejected. Loader's hands moved automatically. Elevation adjusted. Traverse corrected. Across the desert, a Panzer halted abruptly. Smoke vented from its hull. Another lurched sideways, its tracks damaged. German formations began deploying into combat spread, searching for muzzle flashes. Within minutes, the quiet desert became a lattice of tracer, fire, and shell bursts. The anti-tank crews worked in rhythm. Fire, reload, fire again. German tanks attempted to close distance, to use their superior high-explosive rounds against the gun positions. Machine guns raked likely hiding places. Shells struck the sand, throwing up choking clouds. Some British guns were hit. When a gun was knocked out, neighboring crews often continued firing, widening their arcs to compensate. Communication was limited. Signals traveled by runner or shouted, "Command under fire." There was no grand maneuver now, no sweeping flanking movement, only a contest of nerve and accuracy. By midday, multiple German tanks lay burning or mobilized before the British line. The counterattack had not broken through. Instead, it had collided with a barrier that refused to yield. And in that refusal, something larger than a local engagement began to shift. The counterattack did not stop after the first losses. By late morning on the 25th of October 1942, the desert west of Kidney Ridge was scarred with smoke columns. Damaged Panzers smoldered in the sand. Recovery vehicles tried to move forward under intermittent British artillery fire. German commanders regrouped their remaining armor for renewed thrusts. For Erwin Rommel, time was narrowing. The British breach had not yet become a full rupture, but every hour allowed Montgomery's forces to consolidate the corridor. Engineers were widening minefield gaps. Supply vehicles were pushing ammunition and fuel forward. Artillery observers were adjusting fire more precisely. Rommel understood that hesitation would be fatal. Elements of the 15th Panzer Division, supported by units of the 21st Panzer Division, were ordered to press again against the northern penetration. The objective remained unchanged: destroy the British armored concentrations forming beyond the cleared lanes and sever the corridor before it hardened into an immovable front. The terrain offered little cover for either side. Shallow rises, little more than folds in the desert, created deceptive silhouettes. From a distance, British anti-tank guns remained almost invisible. German tank commanders advanced cautiously, attempting to identify muzzle flashes or dust signatures. They maneuvered in short bounds, halting to fire, then shifting position. But the British gun line was deeper than anticipated. 19 anti-tank guns, primarily 6-pounders, had been emplaced in overlapping arcs. They were not arranged in a straight line, but staggered across the shallow ridge, creating intersecting fields of fire. Artillery support stood ready behind them. When the second wave of German armor advanced, the engagement intensified. The first shots came at approximately 800 yards. British gunners aimed deliberately at the lead vehicles, knowing that disabled tanks could block movement and disrupt formation cohesion. Within minutes, multiple Panzers were hit. Some brewed up immediately, others slowed, smoke trailing, before crews abandoned them under machine gun fire. German return fire became concentrated and methodical. High explosive shells bracketed suspected gun positions. Sand and shrapnel tore through exposed crews. Several British guns were silenced. Casualties mounted. Yet the line did not break. British artillery began adding indirect fire onto German assembly areas, complicating regrouping efforts. Air support from the Desert Air Force intermittently strafed Axis armor, forcing them to disperse further. By early afternoon, the battlefield had become a graveyard of stalled steel. The German counterattack, intended to crush the penetration, was instead being consumed by it. By mid-afternoon on the 25th of October, the battle had narrowed into something brutal and precise. The German formations no longer advanced in broad waves. They moved in fragments, troops attempting to exploit small gaps, commanders trying to restore cohesion under constant fire. Dust clouds hung low over the ridge. Visibility fluctuated. Radio traffic grew urgent. The objective had shifted from breakthrough to survival. Reports reaching Rommel indicated heavy losses among forward Panzer elements. Several tanks had been destroyed outright. Others were immobilized, their tracks shattered by solid shot. Recovery under fire proved nearly impossible. Every vehicle disabled represented not only immediate loss, but diminishing operational flexibility for the days ahead. Fuel was already scarce. A single failed assault consumed irreplaceable reserves. Yet abandoning the effort carried its own danger. If British forces stabilized the corridor and reinforced it fully, the Panzer Army would be forced into a defensive posture it was ill-equipped to maintain. German anti-tank guns, including the formidable 88 mm, could still inflict severe losses, but static defense against superior artillery and air power was a losing equation, so the fighting continued. Within the British gun line, the rhythm became mechanical. Loader, layer, firer, each crew worked under mounting strain. Gun barrels heated rapidly. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Some guns shifted position slightly between salvos to avoid being bracketed by return fire. When one gun was knocked out, neighboring positions expanded their arcs. The overlapping fields of fire proved decisive. German tanks attempting to outflank one emplacement exposed their side armor to another. Vehicles advancing cautiously risked becoming stationary targets. Even successful hits on British guns came at cost. Each engagement thinned the Panzer ranks further. By late afternoon, the scale of destruction was undeniable. Dozens of German tanks lay burning or disabled before the British ridge. Smoke columns marked where assaults had faltered. Estimates later suggested that in this sector alone, up to 50 or more Axis tanks were knocked out during the intense exchanges of the 26th of October. A severe blow given total operational strength. The precise figure, 52 Panzers, became associated with the stand of roughly 19 British anti-tank guns holding this critical frontage. Whether counted in confirmed kills or combined destroyed and disabled vehicles, the impact was measurable, a disproportionate exchange that the Axis could not afford. The counterattack had failed, not dramatically, not in a single decisive explosion, but through attrition. As darkness approached, German armor withdrew to reorganize. The corridor remained in British hands. Minefield lanes were widened further during the night. Additional infantry and armor moved forward. The anti-tank guns, battered and reduced, were still in position. And for the first time since arriving in North Africa, Rommel faced a battle he could not regain through maneuver. The initiative had shifted, not in a sweeping charge, but in the refusal of 19 guns to give ground. And from that shift, the broader collapse of Axis resistance at El Alamein began to unfold. The destruction of German armor on the 26th of October did not end the battle, but it changed its character. Before El Alamein, Erwin Rommel had relied on mobility as his decisive instrument. Even when outnumbered, he could maneuver, strike flanks, withdraw, reappear elsewhere. The desert had once given him space. Now that space was gone. The losses suffered in the northern sector, where British anti-tank screens shattered repeated counterattacks had a cumulative effect. Panzer strength declined sharply. Tanks destroyed could not be replaced quickly. Damaged vehicles often remained stranded between the lines, unrecoverable under artillery and air attack. By the 27th of October, operational German tank numbers had dropped significantly from their already limited starting strength. British estimates varied, but it was clear that Axis armored formations were shrinking faster than they could adapt. Fuel stocks worsened the situation. Convoys from Italy had been heavily interdicted by Allied air and naval forces throughout the summer and autumn. What fuel reached North Africa had to be rationed carefully. Each failed counterattack burned reserves that could not be replenished in time. Rommel's army was not collapsing in panic. It was eroding. Meanwhile, Bernard Montgomery maintained pressure deliberately. He did not rush for reckless exploitation. Instead, he rotated units, reinforced successful sectors, and continued methodical assaults designed to exhaust the Axis. British artillery maintained near-continuous harassment. The Desert Air Force increased sorties, striking supply routes and assembly areas. The narrow Alamein corridor meant there was no operational depth for the Germans to retreat into without conceding ground. On the 30th of October, fighting intensified around Kidney Ridge and Tel El Aqwa Kir. German anti-tank defenses remained formidable. The 88 mm guns still exacted heavy losses on advancing British armor, but the balance had shifted irreversibly. For every British tank destroyed, multiple Axis tanks were lost. And unlike the Panzer Army, the 8th Army could replace them. On the 2nd of November 1942, Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge, the next phase of the offensive. Fresh New Zealand and British units attacked in the northern sector, aiming to punch a deeper hole through the Axis line. By then, German armored strength was critically depleted. The earlier stand, where 19 anti-tank guns halted and destroyed dozens of Panzers, had not been a dramatic breakthrough. It had been something more decisive, a breaking of offensive capacity. Rommel could no longer mass armor for decisive counterstroke. The initiative, once his greatest weapon, had slipped beyond recovery. By early November, the consequences of the northern engagement became clear across the entire El Alamein front. German morale, already strained by relentless artillery barrages and extended supply lines, began to falter. Reports from Panzer commanders detailed abandoned vehicles, exhausted crews, and disorganized formations. Units that had previously executed rapid, coordinated maneuvers now moved cautiously, hesitating under fear of concealed anti-tank positions. Rommel himself recognized the shift. On the 3rd of November, after assessing depleted armored units and stretched infantry, he concluded that the Panzer Army Afrika could no longer launch a decisive counterattack. His options had narrowed: dig in defensively, try to delay the inevitable, or withdraw entirely. Yet withdrawing was fraught. Mines, artillery, and increasing Allied pressure meant any retreat risked catastrophic losses. Across the battlefield, the 8th Army continued its methodical advance. Engineers cleared minefield gaps. Artillery adjusted fire onto weak points. Infantry and armor moved forward in a careful, orchestrated rhythm. Where the Axis had once dictated tempo through offensive aggression, they were now responding, always reacting. Casualty figures reflect the scale of attrition. By the 5th of November, Axis armored losses in the northern sector alone were estimated at over 100 tanks destroyed or disabled, a near 50% reduction in their frontline strength in just a few days. British forces, though taking losses themselves, replaced vehicles more quickly and reinforced positions with fresh troops and artillery. Strategically, the stand of those 19 anti-tank guns became symbolic. It was not the largest engagement of the battle, but it demonstrated a key truth. Well-positioned, disciplined defensive positions could blunt Rommel's armored thrusts. The failure of the counterattack directly contributed to the collapse of German initiative. El Alamein had tipped irreversibly in favor of Montgomery. By the 11th of November, 1942, the battle concluded. The Panzer Army, Afrika, began a full-scale withdrawal westward. The northern corridor, once a potential point of Axis exploitation, had become a fortress. Montgomery had seized the initiative, and the broader war in North Africa had begun its turning point. The 19 guns had not merely destroyed tanks. They had shattered the momentum of Rommel's army, setting the stage for the final Allied push that would drive Axis forces from Egypt. History often remembers grand battles in terms of massive offensives and sweeping maneuvers. Yet sometimes, it is the small, precise actions that tip the scales. The stand of 19 anti-tank guns at El Alamein exemplifies this truth. In a barren stretch of desert, against overwhelming odds, disciplined men and carefully sighted weapons disrupted one of the most feared armored armies of the war. 52 Panzers, symbols of mechanized dominance, were destroyed or disabled not by luck or heroic charges, but by calculation, patience, and the integration of human skill with technology. Rommel's reputation for audacity was formidable. His campaigns had earned respect across continents. But even the Desert Fox could not overcome attrition imposed at the right place, at the right time, with relentless precision. Montgomery's methodical planning ensured that small units, given clear purpose and support, could achieve disproportionate effect. The desert swallowed engines, smoke, and sand. Yet it revealed a broader lesson. Warfare is as much about discipline, preparation, and foresight as it is about courage or firepower. The 19 guns did not merely hold a ridge. They broke momentum, shifted initiative, and changed the course of a campaign. El Alamein, often celebrated for its scale and eventual Allied victory, was also won in these quiet, ferocious moments, where a handful of men, concealed in the sand, determined the fate of armies. The human, technical, and tactical threads intertwined, leaving a mark that history preserves not just in numbers, but in the understanding of how warfare itself can be shaped by resolve under pressure. The guns fell silent eventually. The desert returned to its indifferent calm, but the echoes of that stand, the lesson of precise resistance, resonated far beyond the sands of El Alamein.